Ted Knight and 31 other Labour councillors await a High Court judgment on their political future. They could be banned from holding public office and bankrupted. Is this the end of confrontation in London government? Ted Knight and 31 other Lambeth councillors are awaiting the most important decision ever to affect their political careers. In a few days' time, 3 High Court judges will rule on a claim by the district auditor that they broke the law last year in refusing to set a rate. They could then be personally liable to make good Lambeth Council's alleged losses of over £100,000. The evidence from both sides has now been heard, and the judgment will follow soon. When it comes, it will mark the final act of a drama of crucial importance to the Government of London. It could be the vindication of the councillors' stand or set the seal on a total defeat. For councillors like journalist Graham Norwood and mail order worker Helen Crossfield, the verdict of the High Court could spell personal disaster. They live together in this flat in Brixton, which they jointly own on a mortgage. Their share of the alleged loss is about £8,000, and that could rise to over £50,000 if there are subsequent claims. They believe they'd be forced to make a painful decision to pay these bills.
It might mean we'd have to sell our home. Now, since we are without children, we obviously wouldn't be eligible for council housing, and the situation in Lambeth is such that there's no way we'd get council housing anyway. So we'd be forced into a position of either relying on friends or trying to find rented accommodation privately, which is virtually impossible in Lambeth. So we really don't know. I mean, it really could almost mean we're on the street. Seems little alternative.
Although some councillors could also lose their businesses, others who are council tenants will at least keep a roof over their heads. But there's another penalty all will suffer together, just as serious for political activists like Helen Crossfield and Graham Norwood. They'll be barred from holding council office for 5 years, and if bankrupted, would be unable to stand for any public office, including Parliament, until their bankruptcy was discharged. This too would be very hard for them to take.
Certainly it's my opinion that over the last 4 years I've given a lot of personal time, a lot of commitment, and to some extent virtually all my existence has been devoted towards Lambeth Council and trying to do something that we all believe in. Now, the government rewards that with simply telling us that we're going to be thrown out of office, whilst at the same time local people are coming to us with their problems and they're saying that they need us in office in order to defend the services that they use every day.
So if you can produce that.
Council leader Ted Knight won't be put out on the streets because he's a council tenant.
Well, if you could,
but as a full-time politician, his future would be very bleak.
It will, of course, mean that I'm disbarred from council office for the next 5 years. It will mean, if there's a hefty surcharge, which is a major fine, that I certainly couldn't afford to pay it, and therefore face personal bankruptcy in that situation. For me, that will mean a dramatic change in life. Obviously, I've spent 8 years as leader of this council representing local people. I can't do that anymore. I also, obviously, will be in financial difficulties. I don't really know what I will do. For instance, I have to ask myself who would employ me in those circumstances, because I obviously have determined to show that I'm prepared to fight on for principles, and there aren't many private employers that would welcome my coming on to their staff fighting the same struggle as I've done here.
Clearly, there will be immense personal consequences for individual councillors if the High Court judgment goes against them. To some people, the penalties involved will seem too heavy a price for anyone to pay for being loyal to the policies they believe in. For others, it will be seen as the inevitable consequence of elected representatives daring to flout the law of the land. But whatever view is taken, there's no doubt that the issues of the case are serious. for it may cast the final seal on the long-running fight between the London Labour left and the Conservative government. Local councils, especially London Labour councils, have been in a state of near open warfare with the Conservative government ever since it came to power 6 years ago. Since 1979, the government has made repeated efforts to cut their spending, but it failed. Until 1984, the main measure used was to penalise high-spending councils by withdrawing government grants. But far from reducing spending, this caused rates to shoot up. Last year, council leaders faced their biggest challenge. The then Environment Secretary, Patrick Jenkin, acted to limit the maximum rates of selected councils.
Though we tried in the last Parliament to avoid taking direct controls over the amount of rates, we've now been driven to it, and we published a white paper in August, and we shall be legislating in this session of Parliament. We're in our sights somewhere between a dozen and 20 really high-spending councils whose ratepayers have been taken for a ride.
In addition to the GLC and the Inner London Education Authority, 9 London Borough Councils were amongst those singled out. They were Islington, Camden, Brent, Haringey, Hackney, Lewisham, Southwark, Greenwich and Lambeth. And leaders from all of them, except Brent, which was Tory-controlled, argued that if they accepted the government's limits on their rate income and still balanced their books, they'd have to make swinging, painful cuts. Leader of Southwark Council, Tony Ritchie.
What we have to be showing our people and our voters that what is taking place to them is an attack on their standard of living, an attack by the Tories to redistribute the resources from those in need to those who already have plenty already.
But from the start, there was dispute about whether council services really were at risk from the limits imposed in the first year of rate capping. Even within the London Labour Party, some people argued that it would be possible to abide by government limits and still finance all-important spending.
I proposed, and I thought at one time that most of my colleagues were accepting, what became known as the fudging option, which meant making whatever savings, legitimate savings we could, whilst maintaining jobs and services, but then bridging the gap between expenditure and income by various methods of creative financing.
But London Labour leaders took a different view. At repeated meetings like this one in January last year at London University's Institute of Education, they argued that their councils should refuse to set a rate at all, thus challenging the government to either back down or see services grind to a halt. Ted Knight was a prime mover in getting this strategy adopted.
Well, ever since the idea of Labour councils refusing to set a rate was first mooted, it was Ted Knight who was the advocate of it, who set himself at the forefront of the campaign for it, who won over the London Labour Party as a whole to adopt that policy, and who tried to orchestrate and synchronise the campaign between the different London boroughs and the GLC.
But even at this stage, it was recognised that the strategy of refusing to set a rate could put councillors at risk. Although the law was not crystal clear, it was widely thought that councillors might be held responsible for any damage their action might do to the finances of their authorities. This risk was clearest for the ILEA and the GLC, for as higher tier authorities, they faced a firm date by which they had to set a rate. The anti-rate front began to collapse with the acquiescence of Ken Livingstone.
Everyone was warned about this. I have not made a single public speech or taken part in any debate privately within the party about rate capping in which I have not said it will be very difficult to actually get this sort of policy through the GLC.
In other authorities, the major activity of activists became persuading Labour councillors to hold the line. Considerable pressure was applied to moderates.
There was pressure from the parties, your local party, even in some cases from the wards. I was lucky, my own ward was 100% behind me all the time. From the trade unions, it reached quite severe levels, not even pressure, intimidation in the end. Nasty circulars, we were called scabs, traitors, God knows what else, threatened with deselection, being kicked out of off the council, and so on.
But this pressure could not prevent a collapse. Lewisham and Haringey were the first to set rates. Hackney was next, and the scenes started to get ugly. In Southwark, demonstrators had to be expelled from the council chamber, and the press were thrown out of a council meeting. But eventually a rate was set. Islington, Camden and Greenwich all set rates by the first week of June. Only Lambeth remained, and it held out for nearly another month. Violence broke out when, 3 months into the financial year, it too set a legal rate. But as a last to cave in, Lambeth councillors were the obvious first target for the district auditor. The district auditor, Brian Skinner, is arguing that through willful misconduct, Lambeth lost money by not collecting rates on Crown property and not picking up the rate element of housing benefit subsidy, a total of £127,000. Ted Knight and the other councillors deny this. They say there was no willful misconduct, that they've been denied natural justice, and argue further that because of the technicalities of local government finance, Lambeth actually made financial gains through increases in government grants.
Our legal defence in the courts was that it is impossible for a district auditor to step in at one moment during the course of a financial year and take a snapshot of the budget at that point in time. He has described losses that occurred at a certain period. We, however, can demonstrate that if you take the year as a whole, that we have made gains. In fact, the gains, in our opinion, and the opinion of our lawyers, well outweighed the losses that he identified.
All the evidence and arguments have now been put before the court. All that remains is the verdict of the 3 judges. They may not have the last word, as either side will have a right to further appeal, but their decision is nevertheless keenly awaited, for there's a lot at stake, and not just in Lambeth. If the High Court judges find against the Lambeth councillors, that would open the door for the district auditor to surcharge Labour members in other councils that delayed setting rates. Those thought to be most at risk are Islington, Camden, Hackney, Southwark and Greenwich. They could all go the way of Lambeth. 200 more councillors could be surcharged.
If it is a judgment which suggests that here were a group of honest and reasonable councillors who had somehow fallen foul of the law, I would have thought that the district auditor would not find in that any pressure to move immediately against the other councils. If, on the other hand, the court comes down heavily and says that this was a flagrant breach of the law, then I would have thought the auditor would be sorely moved to take action quickly against other London authorities who had also delayed making a rate.
If there were further surcharges, a number of very influential people could vanish from the political scene. First of all, there are well-known council leaders, not just Ted Knight, but also Margaret Hodge from Islington and Tony Ritchie from Southwark. Both could be disqualified. Then there are prospective parliamentary candidates. John Austin Walker, the leader of Greenwich, is standing in Woolwich. Phil Turner, the leader in Camden, is standing in Hampstead, and Valerie Verness from Islington is standing in Nuneaton. All could be forced to withdraw from fighting the next general election. Even better-known figures from outside London could be affected. David Blunkett, the leader of Sheffield Council, is not only a parliamentary candidate, but also a member of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party. He could also be barred from office if the Lambeth case sets a precedent for other councils. So the Lambeth case could clearly have widespread consequences. It could bring about serious problems, not least for the Labour leadership.
The problem particularly focuses on an individual who's outside London, David Blunkett, the leader of Sheffield Council. It would be very difficult for the Labour Party not to defend him in the courts when he would be arguing that all he was doing was implementing Labour conference policy. But that would be very difficult for Mr. Kinnock, because that would suck him back into the issue of indemnity for people breaking the law.
Widespread use of the surcharge could also have a devastating effect on the government of a number of London boroughs. Up to 200 by-elections would have to be held, and even if new Labour candidates won them, Londoners would still feel the change, for the newcomers would be very inexperienced.
The standard of councillors will deteriorate, which means increasingly powers will devolve on the officers. But in addition to that, everyone in local government is going to become so nervous, they'll be very reluctant to make any decisions on any new issue unless they're absolutely certain that it's legally okay.
But in Lambeth, the effect would be more immediate. Ted Knight could be removed from office before the local elections in May, giving the Tories a powerful boost for their propaganda.
The Conservative Party in London would be reminding the electorate that when they vote in the local elections on the 8th of May, the left-wing Labour Party in London really operates outside the law and has, as it were, been convicted of doing so.
The removal of Knight could also have a wider impact on Labour politics in London. He took control of Lambeth in 1978 and was quickly stereotyped by the media as a symbol of the new brand of left-wing Labour politicians in London. Red Ted was the most popular catchphrase in the right-wing press. And he did move quickly beyond the confines of Lambeth politics. In 1981, he and Ken Livingstone launched a new journal of the hard left, the Labour Herald. He's still one of the editors. And as the struggle between local and central government grew more bitter, he did become a leading spokesman of the left.
Now that's the Tory method that you want us to follow.
But Ted Knight also suffered setbacks. In 1981, he was the Labour candidate in Norwood for the GLC elections and lost what should have been a safe Labour seat to the Tories.
But it doesn't mean at all a personal defeat in that sense.
And 3 months ago, he nearly lost the nomination for his own ward, Ferndale, in the coming council elections. Only last-minute manoeuvring saved the day.
A number of the other candidates were persuaded to stand down, which brought him onto the shortlist. And then he put enormous pressure on the members in the ward and all his friends and supporters to come to the meeting, and indeed on some of the others not to vote against him, because his entire future was at stake.
If the High Court verdict goes against Knight, he could be in very serious trouble. As the leading light of the no-rate strategy, he's bound to carry the can. It's argued that few London Labour activists will take him seriously again.
He was the general who led the army into this battle, and it's his judgment that's really at stake. And if he loses this court case, it will be seen very clearly that the strategy was never going to win from the start. And I think, although he's a great survivor in politics, and he will certainly not disappear, his future will look extremely bleak.
Since the failure of the stand against rate capping, the coalition that Ted Knight helped to build has largely splintered. Leading figures like Ken Livingstone have seemingly abandoned the politics of confrontation and joined the Kinnock camp. If Knight is now rendered ineffective as well, the prospects of such a coalition ever being rebuilt may well be diminished. His failure is likely to be seen as a powerful warning.
There will come other occasions, no doubt, in future when a local authority wants to take on the government. And if the Lambeth councillors go down this time, the difficulty of actually persuading individual councillors to back that sort of action when there is this sort of penalty and result would be very difficult.
But it's in the government of Lambeth itself that the most dramatic change will be felt. This is the Housing Management Subcommittee, one of its most important. At present, it has 7 Labour members, 1 from the Alliance and 2 Tories. In spite of a narrow overall majority in the council, Labour are still in firm control.
Can we move on then to the next item?
But nearly all Lambeth Labour councillors will be disqualified if they lose their case. The council would then be controlled by the Conservatives, led by Mary Lee, for the crucial period before the May elections. She's already made her plans.
We would immediately look at the public relations budget, which is now approaching £700,000. And if you take penalty into account, double that. And that's an immediate area of savings. We need to have an information programme, any council does, but not to that extent. We would look at the Women's Committee and the Police Committee. We don't feel that We need a police committee. We have a very good community liaison group where the genuine community sit down with the police and discuss their problems.
But even worse could be in store for the Lambeth Labour Party. Councillors like Gordon Lay are already working to increase the Labour vote in the local elections by making sure that potential Labour voters are registered.
I don't know if you're aware there's an election coming up in May, local council election.
This hard work is already showing signs of paying off.
On an average around the borough is 55% of the households registered. Here in Prince's Ward it's 75% of the households registered. That's basically the hard work that we've done going knocking on doors.
But if councillors like Gordon Lay are disqualified in the month before the election, it will, by election rules, be too late to enter replacements. 27 Labour seats could fall to the Tories or the Alliance. The Lambeth Labour Party could be forced into some very last-ditch tactics.
We would carry on and fight. We'd have no choice. Our names would be on the ballot paper, and we would argue that they should remain on the ballot paper and that votes should come in for the Labour candidates, and there's no doubt that that's what would happen. We would win the election, even though in practice we were disqualified.
If Ted Knight and his colleagues were able to pull off the coup of getting voters to support them, even though they'd be unable to take their seats, then they would undoubtedly have won a considerable propaganda victory. However, it would still be very unlikely that the government would be willing or able to lift their suspension retrospectively. They'd still be out of office. But of course, it's by no means certain that the High Court judgment will go against the Lambeth councillors. Their barristers have put their case to the three judges with force and clarity. If they did win their case then, what would a victory enable them to do? The first thing a victory would do is to give Ted Knight an opportunity to claim that his stand over rate capping had been vindicated, and he could go further. He could point a finger at the councillors across London who backed down and brought about the collapse of the no-rate strategy.
If Lambeth councillors win in the court, as we believe we will, then it will show to every Labour councillor throughout London and other city areas that we're unable to withstand the pressure of the district auditor, that in practice unpalatable decisions which the district auditor took can be resisted. In other words, it is possible to get more resources from this government. It is right and justified to fight for them, and therefore those Labour councillors who could not decide on that course of action will now be encouraged to fight on in the future.
But local politicians won't be the only ones that Ted Knight would be aiming at. He'd also be gunning for the Labour leadership, hoping to drive the party towards yet more confrontation.
A victory in the courts, I think, would show the Labour Party leadership who hesitated to support us in the rate capping fight, who thought that we had gone too far, that we couldn't sustain the campaign that we'd engaged in, would show them in practice we were right, that there is support for us to follow that course of action. I would hope that would mean that in future the Labour Party leadership would come well behind everybody in a fight like this. They won't hesitate in the coming year, for instance, to support those Labour councillors who will be faced with similar problems and may have to take similar decisions. They won't use the law as a threat, as frankly Labour leaders did, against councillors fighting in that struggle.
But Labour leaders like John Cunningham, the Shadow Environment Secretary, believe Ted Knight would not be supported by the party.
Calls to the Labour Party to detach itself from Neil Kinnock's leadership and the course that he's set will find few supporters. This was emphasised a couple of weeks ago at the Labour Party's local government conference in Norwich. Over 1,000 delegates present, the biggest local government conference in Europe, massively endorsed the speech of the leader and the strategy he's marked out for the Labour Party. I don't think anything that anyone might say on the hard left is going to change that.
Whether or not this assessment is right, Ted Knight may well have missed his moment to bid for more confrontation. The government is rushing a new local government bill through Parliament. It should be passed by the end of March. It will make it clearly illegal to delay setting rates this year, whatever the outcome of the court case. So it seems likely that Ted Knight's chances of raising the flag of confrontation over London's town halls will be low, whatever the judgment in the High Court. More likely by far is that we're about to witness his departure from the centre stage of London politics. But for hundreds of other councillors across London, the case will still be crucially important. It will decide whether they too have to join him in relative obscurity.